All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. My name is Asia Washington. I'm one of the hosts and lead programmer for the Black, Bold, and Brilliant team. So excited to have everyone here tonight. We will get to introductions in a second, but want to give Rashawn a minute to introduce himself.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. My name is Rashawn. I'm also a co-host. Appreciate you all coming out because I know the weather was not friendly. And so thank you. And I hope you all enjoy this panel as much as we are. I'll start with Carl. Carl Moore. Carl is an indigenous activist and defender of both political and sacred sovereignty of indigenous people. He is a tribal member of the Colorado River Indian tribes, being both Hopi and Chemehueva. Carl studied political science and American Indian studies at Utah Valley University. He is the initiator and co-founder of 2 indigenous-led nonprofits in SLC since 2016, Pandos and SLC Air Protectors. He also advocates for the SLC unsheltered community by giving both material and emotional support. Welcome, Carl, to the panel.
Thank you.
This is not in order of how they're sitting here, but tonight we also have Dave John. Dave is Tewa and Dene, and Pandos' co-founder, helped organize the December 2016 music festival for raising funds for the legal funds for Standing Rock water protectors, the Pandos Defend the Sacred Powwow, the Pandos COVID-19 mobile unit, and the Mini Luzon Camp COVID-19 mobile unit in Rapid City. He also helped organize the Pandos Virtual Music Festival to raise funds to purchase the COVID-19 testing kits and Red Fawn's Protect All Things Sacred powwow. Dave is also the co-host of KRCL's Living the Circle of Life program. Welcome, Dave John.
Well, thank you.
Valine Peretrovich. Valine is Tinglet, Eagle, what is it?
Tlingit.
Yeah, click it. Okay, you can pronounce. Okay, what's
So
the
let me
Eagle?
Tlingit of the Eagle Moiety Unangan and Athabasca Nations.
She is currently a film student at Salt Lake Community College and studied human and family sciences and chemistry with Oregon State University, University of Alaska Fairbanks, and University of Hawaii at Manoa. She was born into a human rights and politically conscious family. Her great-aunt and great-uncle, Elizabeth and Roy Petrova, led the civil rights movement in the 1940s when Alaska was segregated much like the South. They fought to have the first anti-discrimination bill passed in Alaska and were successful in 1945 when it was signed into law. And she is also a co-host of KRCL's Living the Circle of Life program. Welcome, Valine, to the program.
Thank you.
All right, last and certainly not least, we have Robert Birch, who is the executive director of Sema Hadithi, the African American Heritage and Culture Foundation, which is a nonprofit that researches African American history in Utah and the Mountain West. He is principal of Sema Hadithi LLC, an e-commerce business that provides research services and Afrocentric products online. His volunteer career includes the Utah chapter president and national board member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, vice president and charter board member of Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, family history director of the LDS Genesis Group, Utah Juneteenth Committee, and the Utah Black Roundtable. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, so we really wanted to have this conversation tonight. You know, this month marks, I believe it's Indigenous Peoples Month, so we really wanted to, as Black, Bold, and Brilliant team, to kind of talk about the relationship between the Black community, Indigenous communities here, especially in Northern America, and also kind of the crossover that happens with United States and reparations among our communities. And so I think to get started, we can kind of put things in context of how we put this together, and we do have a clip that we'd like to show to represent that.
The Greenwood District was one of the most prominent and affluent Black communities in the country. It was a symbol of what is possible for Black people in America. But to understand the story of Black Wall Street, we have to go back to the Trail of Tears.
First Black people to come to Oklahoma were actually members of the Native American tribes.
The 5 tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, were slave-holding tribes. Some of them wanted to show that they were in allyship by mimicking what like the white settlers are doing.
Indigenous people were affected by anti-Black racism. That process invited them into the slaveholder culture, even as they were subject to the worst forms of oppression and discrimination of themselves.
When the 5 tribes signed a removal treaty, they had to remove their Black slaves too.
The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forcibly evicts Native American tribes in the Southeast and transfers their lands to white farmers to expand cotton plantations. Over 100,000 Native Americans and approximately 4,000 enslaved African Americans make the treacherous journey to Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. The over 5,000-mile brutal and deadly removal is known as the Trail of Tears and Death.
When everybody got to Oklahoma through many different ways, Black people were still enslaved here. They still were property. And they had to rebuild what the Indian tribes had in the Deep South.
After the Civil War, you had freedmen living in Oklahoma.
You have a freed Black population able to live on tribal lands in a communal way.
The Dawes Act passed in 1887, allowing the federal government to break up tribal lands into individual plots.
Black people in Oklahoma owned more land than in any other part of the country. About 2 million acres of land were allotted to the freedmen. So when you think about 40 acres and a mule and that false promise after the Civil War, Black people actually got that in Oklahoma.
Those land allotments become the seeds of more than 50 Black towns that emerge in Oklahoma. More than any other state in the country.
Once the 5 tribes received their allotment, then whatever was left, that was deemed surplus, and the government opened it for sale to whoever wanted to buy it.
O.W. Gurley was a Southerner who hailed from Arkansas, who came to Tulsa to purchase land. The land that Greenwood exists on was not land that whites at the time deemed as valuable, but it's land that could be sold to quote unquote a Negro buyer. Gurley purchases an allotment of land. His goal was to incubate a Black community.
O.W. Gurley opened a grocery store on what would become Greenwood Avenue. He was really able to tap into a lot of dynamics happening throughout the state where people would be traveling through different communities, and some of the freedmen ended up settling in Greenwood. They were able to provide some of that nurturing wealth.
Land for recently enslaved people is everything, because we have to imagine a world in which an enslaved person did not have property rights in themselves.
All right. So that hopefully gives you some context about this conversation. There's a long and complicated history between African Americans and indigenous tribes, certain indigenous tribes, and I think also, you know, there's a complicated history for maybe some Black Americans that also served on militias and stuff that also took over indigenous lands. And so there's this, you know, again, complicated history. And so just want to like kind of talk about maybe how our communities can come together or make any repair that needs to happen to move forward, because obviously we kind of have some common ground and common enemies in this. Just your thoughts on kind of like how our communities can build solidarity with each other, and any one of you can start.
I'm going to start. Because first, I just want to kind of, because this goes to the question here, because these are my flags right here. And these are things that I stand for, and us as PANDOS, SLCR protectors, our unsheltered relatives. This is something that we believe. This is something that is inherent to us as indigenous people, that we're all related. I mean, that's at the core of it. We're all related. We're relatives. We're like a family. And all of these flags are emblematic of us being related. Even before the George Floyd thing blew up, I was a big advocate for Black Lives Matter. I often here in Salt Lake City prayed for Black Lives Matter events, for the protests, for the rallies, for the events, holding space and stuff like that. So I just want to say, this is a way that we show solidarity, and it's about solidarity, right? So like us as indigenous people, like all of us as activists at Standing Rock, you know, out of Standing Rock, we basically just went into the issues of the day, and that Black Lives Matter. That's what was going on. So when we hear all of this bullcrap from people that are saying all lives matter, why are you saying this? You're not Black, whatever. It's because that's not the issue. The issue is that this is a movement. Okay, this is a movement that's going on. So I'm gonna go right now to the AIM flag, right? So this is the AIM flag. This is the American Indian Movement flag that shows the 4 different colors, the 4 different people groups, the 4 different directions, the AIM symbol. The AIM American Indian Movement, that started with the human rights, the civil rights. That's what was going on. I mean, you had AIM representatives marching with Martin Luther King Jr., you know, with those people, you know. And they marched with us. So it was that similar struggle that we had together. And then, again, you mean, obviously this is the gay pride flag, but this is a two-spirit one. So this is for indigenous people, because, you know, like we've seen here, like slavery, like we have been colonized ourselves as indigenous people to, like, our minds are just so effed up, you know, that it's hard for us to kind of conceptualize what we used to conceptualize before colonial thought, mainly like Protestant Christianity, Catholicism, those things. So two spirits, it's a way of living. It was a way for us to live. I mean, and it's hard to conceptualize it from an indigenous way to the current culture way, but basically it's gay, it's the LGBTQ community. That's two-spirit, right? And then obviously we have the trans flag here. And I made this trans flag when we did Camp Last Hope, and this is where ours started. But so I do a lot of work for the unsheltered community here in Salt Lake. But this was a camp that we did in defiance of Salt Lake City. And we'll get into that, like Salt Lake City in Utah. And whose land is it? It's not Salt Lake City's land. It's not Utah's land. It's not the United States of America's land. It's indigenous people's land, specifically Ute, Shoshone, Goshute people's land. But anyway, that's our logo right there, Last Hope. And then Stop Line 3, myself and Dave, you know, we went up to hold space, and also in protest of Line 3, you know, which was up there in Minnesota, which we were connected to by going up to Mini-Luzahan, you know, supporting them and their tribe up there, Rapid City, those tribes up there. But again, you have the 4 different colors because we're all related, right? And again, you know, another Black Lives Matter flag. So this, I think, should be the core of where we all start from, is recognition that we're all related. And I'll stop there because I'll talk some more about other things.
Thank you for that, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.
I find it interesting, too, and I guess like most people I had to learn this, is that Black people interconnectivity with Native nations go all the way back to 1619. Because we know that when those indentured servants was taken off that English ship and dumped in Port Comfort, there was a conflict between the colony and the people of the land, which ended with half of the colony being wiped out. And that's included the black members of the colony. That's how we get the first names of those 20-odd Negroes that they say that they counted after that conflict with the natives. So we understand, even from the first time that Africans have been brought to this land, there's been this kind of relationship, friendly and unfriendly, with natives. Just like most people, interconnectivity is sometimes friendly, sometimes difficult. So that relationship for us started a long time ago. Also, most people don't understand that when the Civil War ended in 1865, slavery ended for everybody. Because in Utah, there were black slaves and there was Native Nation slaves. So just like you were suggesting about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when we win rights for people, it's rights for everyone. So those indigenous that were being enslaved, their freedom came from slavery just as well as African Americans. And there are all kind of connections that we can make like that, whether it's the Buffalo Soldiers. You know, we had black soldiers out here in the Utah Territory starting in 1886, and they were brought here to fight the Native Nations. So almost 900 out in Duchesne, 900 here in Salt Lake City. And so African Americans in Utah participated in a lot of the conflict throughout the territory, whether it was Oklahoma, Wyoming, Colorado. So there's always been this closeness in dealing with Native Americans that we either don't know about or we forget or we choose to ignore. With one of them that was brought out in this film here is working in family history and genealogy. We meet a lot of black folks across the nation who like to claim connections to Native nations.
Yeah, we do.
But do not want to accept the condition in which they were a part of the Native nations. Because if you used to show a black person in Atlanta that perhaps their relatives was a slave to the Cherokee or another nation out there, they wouldn't accept it. And I have to explain to them, there is a difference between being culturally Native American and genetically Native Americans. Because I am African and 94% African to this day, but just because I dress like a European doesn't mean I'm English, right? And so we have those conversations that are helping people to understand that interconnectivity is not always what you think it is. And sometimes it's difficult for people to accept that. And when I've met with, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the group now, but anyway, we had a convention out in Washington, D.C. that talked about Oklahoma. This is the first time I ever learned about Oklahoma and why so many black townships was in Oklahoma. I knew that it was because the state of Oklahoma actually doesn't record 50 black townships. The state of Oklahoma records more than 100 black townships in Oklahoma that used to exist. And so that means that a lot of Native nations were displaced. So we have this kind of interconnectivity that we a lot of time account to white and natives, but it's black folk as well.
And I'd like to pause before we go on and do a land acknowledgement.
And first off, I'd like to introduce myself, even though Rashawn was kind enough to introduce me. My name is Valine Peratrovich, and I am the daughter of Charmaine Peratrovich and granddaughter of Mary Peratrovich, and I am of the Tlingit Eagle Moiety. And when I say that to you, the reason why I share that is because we inherit the names and the clans, the family of our mothers. And I stand here honoring them as I stand on their shoulders of greatness in those Indigenous women. And if I can, there was a land acknowledgement in the film, but on behalf of the panel, and those of you here today, I would like to do this too. And that we acknowledge that our forum here is located on Native American shared territory of the Goshute, Navajo, Ordine, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute people. And we honor the original ancestors of this land and also offer respect to other tribal communities. We acknowledge the history to cultivate respect for and advocate with our Indigenous community members that are still connected to this land. Koyana.
Thank you.
And I guess since I kind of have the mic now, well, I guess I always did, I'll share a little bit where I come from. It's really important that I say that this is my individual experience and how I see this, how I am experiencing this as an Indigenous woman and mother in the here and now. I tell my stories through radio, journalism, and film. And I think we have amazing warriors and activists and historians that carry this torch. That is not who I am, and that is not how I come here. I don't believe I can speak to you and share with you unless I connect with your heart and you see me as a human, exactly as you are living this experience. And watching that clip and what that brings up for me, and what Robert shared, which I really felt was important, is that in my culture, in Tlingit culture, there was enslavement of different tribes. And when the Emancipation Proclamation, we had to stop the enslavement, and they fought. And people have a tendency, I don't know why, I really don't, maybe other people can speak to this, but people romanticize a lot of what it means to be an Indigenous person here now in our ancestors, when we are human, just like you. When you see us like that, we can move forward. And I feel like when I see that film, that's what this is asking. And a lot of what I see there when that happens and what you shared was people go into denial. It's painful. And what I see sometimes when people get stuck in that pain or denial is if you can accept the human experience of what you're having is grief. It is the beginning of grief. And people don't recognize that, so then they don't know what to do with it, and then we cycle through denial. When people are just asking for their stories to be heard, for this history to be acknowledged. And then once you do that, you can move through individually, collectively, tribally, as a race, move through the stages of grief. And then eventually we move to acceptance to heal with each other. So that's what I see when I see this. So you're gonna hear a lot of heart talk from me. Again, we have amazing warriors carrying the torch of activism and historians. So this is what I come for. And sharing that, I really do think you have to let the wound breathe first. Because right now all it does is fester. And we're not perfect people, we're humans. Each and every one of us, including Indigenous people. Thank you.
Yeah, because when I hear about the Trail of Tears and how the Cherokees and other nations were displaced from fruitful land, it's always been, we knew how to take care of the land because we were placed in certain areas to be stewards all over Turtle Island, It doesn't matter, the borderlines divide us, they want us to believe North America, Central America, South America. But one thing, a lot of them, when I have conversation with people that are kind of ignorant, is they don't think Mexican is a native, but yet they are native, and that's the thing. It doesn't matter where they're from, South America, Central, they're native to this land, but it's just that mind block where they can't see. They see a Mexican, not a native. When they have that idea of native, they see, oh yeah, the guy with the feathers, the buckskin, the elk teeth, to them, that's the only idea of Native, you know. I mean, we have black brothers that are Native too, because with all the, I guess, coexistence, you know, from getting away from the colonists, you know, hiding, but then there's always a way to live together. And that's why even Native communities, we have dark-skinned brothers, you know, our relatives. You know, we even have light-skinned relatives. You look along the Canada border, you know, you have natives with green eyes, light hair, you know. But I guess the colonial mindset, they only have a picture of one type of native, you know. And that's one thing that we need to educate these people on, is open your mind, because there's so many relations. And like when Carl was mentioning all these flags here, this one here, the Ames flag, see, it's the 4 colors of man. And, you know, you got the red man, you got the white man, you got the yellow man, you got the black man. So that's what the Ames flag represents. And it also reminds me of an interview with John Lennon when he was talking about the Native people and how he saw America treat them, you know, and he couldn't believe, like, well, they were the first people here. You should be honoring them, you know, coexisting with them, but yet they're below you. And one of the statements was, you know, he says, you know, kind of like, one of these days, you know, the brown man will join the black man, you know, because they're going through the same struggles. And which with any other race, you know, we always form a better bond, you know, because like when I'm on the show on Sunday morning, I start off with, good morning, my relatives, you know, because to me, you know, we're all relatives one way or another, you know, and that's why this 4 colors is pretty powerful within the indigenous nations, you know, because they see we're one way or another, we're related, you know. But yeah, that's just one thing, is where, you know, with the Trail of Tears, you know, you look at any Native history, the Navajos, the longest walk, they were always displaced. Any tribe was displaced. There was one way, they were on a journey. Yeah, we lost a lot of, you know, relatives on those walks and stuff. And the lucky thing about it, a lot of them returned to their homelands. Some didn't, you know, so. But then too, with me, I think, you know, there was a reason why some of them didn't come back, because the Creator wanted them in that area to become stewards of that land. And if you ever looked at how a Native can survive, especially the Apaches, if you ever see their homelands, you know, it's desert. But yet they survive, you know, they learn to adapt. And I think with any tribe in Turtle Island, they became one with the land. They knew how to survive, you know, they didn't become greedy and take more that they wanted, they just took what they needed. Even when they took sage or anything like that, they would leave an offering of tobacco, you know, as a trade. And so it was just showing respect, you know. And that wasn't just the 2-legged relations, you know, it was the 4-legged, the wing relatives. So there was always that connection with Mother Earth. And I think that's why the Native people are still here, is because we draw our strength off Mother Nature, our Mother Earth, you know, and she provides for us. And, you know, that's why we try to take care of her. That's why we fight for Mother Earth, you know.
All right. Yeah. I remember when we were planning this show, and they first showed me this clip, and I used to be, before I was an English major, I was a history major, so I knew about the Trails of Tears, but I never knew about the intersectionality between us as Black people and Trail of Tears. And you know what you were saying, well, what everybody was saying, really, it really started me thinking, like, you know, because I'm sure everybody in the room knows about the Trail of Tears, and we know about the Tulsa massacre, but we don't know, we don't group them together, and I don't know if that's always the case. So you mentioned something, Carl, and I want to stay with you for a second, but I really want to open up to the panel. But as we start learning more, like how do we fully decolonize our minds? Because we have to break away from the things we were taught, because we're taught history based on the victor, it feels like, and that's obviously, as we learn more, that is not true history. That is just a version of someone's history. So to really, to Asia's original question, and really repairing the relationships of not just our group, but just marginalized people in general, like, what does that look like? How do we start that process? How do we break it down, and I'll use the term decolonizing our minds to open up that space?
All right, thank you, because I wanted to talk about this, because there's a lot. Okay, so, and I just lost my train of thought. But there's a lot. Okay, so decolonize our mind. Oh, first I want to acknowledge a couple things. Well, I want to say that the only way that we can move forward is by correct history, right? By correct truth, by acknowledging the parts that we had that were bad, that were good, whatever. It's acknowledgement. I know that myself particularly, and I'm sorry, you mispronounced it. It's Hopi and Chemehuevi. It's okay. But the Hopi people, will always say, oh, we're the nice people, the peaceful people. I mean, that's what Hopi means, the peaceful people, the people, But we didn't always do nice things to each other. I mean, we actually separated. We had people that wanted to go along with the United States government and educate our children, and they're like, okay, this is our future. Our children need to be educated, and they need to become Europeanized or whatever. And there were the other leaders that were saying, no, we need to stay Hopi. We need to stay Hopi. And there was this conflict, and that conflict resulted in the people that wanted to remain Hopi got kicked out. And they got kicked out in the wintertime, got kicked out. They had to go make their own village. I'm just saying, acknowledge, right? And I like that you said what you said, Val. It's like we need to acknowledge our part in all of this, right? And I think that's the hardest thing for Americans or European Americans or whatever to do is they can acknowledge somewhat, but there's always a but. Oh my, there's so many buts, it's like, but if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have this. If it wasn't for us, I got told this, I did a lot of talking with people in the militia and whatever, but you'd all be running around naked or something like that. And I'm thinking, one is what's wrong with running around naked? It's the only reason why that's wrong is because of y'all said you brought this modesty concept that we didn't have, So what we did was okay, and y'all just not y'all, sorry, but European Americans they have this way of saying this is what's right, this is what's right, this is what we do, and what we did was good. It was good for you. I grew up LDS. So I'm not LDS anymore. I want to make that clear. I grew up LDS, and so then you hear of this history of the Lamanites coming over, and they were supposed to take care of this place. If we didn't take care of this place, then it would have gotten taken over, whatever. So it was a good thing that Europeans came. It was a good thing that we got taken over. It was a good thing so that Joseph Smith could do his thing, right? I fell for that. I thought, oh, that's a good thing. Just like in my Native American outfit in my regalia, I used to wear red, white, and blue. I used to represent the United States of America. I used to rep that shit, okay? And then it is about education. It is about acknowledging the truth. And that's the core of all of this is recognizing the truth. But to decolonize our minds, let me just say this, is it goes back to language. Everything is rooted in your language, in your historical language, because that is the way that we were taught, I'd say by the Creator, to conceptualize everything. And what happens now is in the academy, English. Just by English alone being the way that we communicate with each other, we have been colonized, and we have no idea how to conceptualize anything other than through a European lens. Acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that. So unless we can let our elders come back, and that was another part of the AIM movement. It wasn't just about being militant and basically land back from that time, but it was also bring back the culture, bring back the spirituality, bring back who we were. I don't know where I'm going with all of this.
I'm loving it.
It's awesome.
No, it's good.
But decolonizing, it's acknowledging history, it's acknowledging our part in it, and it's also elevating each other. Solidarity, being unified as all of these groups, you know, and people being accountable. And we'll get to that, you know, in the United States, I'd say abolish the United States, get rid of it. It started with a faulty foundation. You know, in Christianity, you say if the roots are bad, the whole damn tree's bad. No, they don't say the damn tree, but if the roots are bad, the tree's bad. The roots are bad. Okay? All right.
And similarly, I would say, you know, like a lot of African Americans are also, you know, getting back to their roots and practicing traditional African religions and following that spirituality. And I think a lot of us are starting to try and decolonize our minds spiritually, you know.
Yeah, breaking away from Christianity.
I want to echo what Carl said about truth. If you go to our website, samhadithi.org, one of the first things you will find on there is that our theme is unity through historical truth. We spend too much time fighting, and we spend too much time fighting over lies. The things we're fighting about are not even real, right? Dave said we oversimplify Native Americans. The first thing we have to do is stop simplifying people. Most people, when I tell them there are different cultures of African Americans in the United States, they look at me like I'm crazy because they don't understand that all black people ain't the same. They have this simplified caricature of what a black person is. Just like they have a simplified caricature of what a Native person is, right? We can accept Europe as being complicated. They're French, they're Spanish, they're English, they're Italians. They all have different sensibilities. But you know, that continent is the smallest continent on the planet, right? With the smallest population on the planet. That continent has 24 primary languages, 200 secondary and tertiary languages. The continent of Africa has 200 primary languages and over 2,000 secondary and tertiary languages. Which place do you think is more complicated? Oh, we know. So we have to get over this idea that we can simplify a black man to one thing. You know, because if you follow politics and you see some of the people who are supposedly representing us, many of you are going like, I hope all black folks ain't like that, right? So that's one of the things we have to get rid of this colonized attitude is to quit oversimplifying our brothers and sisters. Quit trying to make them one thing. And the other thing that Carl hit on was language. When you change a person's language, you change how they think, how they act, how they interact with other people, how they interact with the environment. You completely destroy their culture. So substantively, for me, even though my DNA says I'm Nigerian, I don't know anything about being a Nigerian. I don't even know what the language is. So we have to understand that when we rob people of their culture, we have robbed them of everything, especially through language, that is different about them. And so understand that, you know, there's a different kind of black in the United States. Just like there's a different kind of Native nation in the United States. So we just have to quit oversimplifying people, and we have to really talk about the truth.
I do want to switch gears because, Carl, you brought up specifically LandBack. Do want to get into that and like what that could mean, not just here in so-called Salt Lake City, but here in the United States and North America and on other indigenous lands. So if we could go to the second clip, we'll get into that.
LandBack just means so much to me. It means us not putting up with it anymore, not taking it anymore. I've heard the same thing from my grandparents that I heard from my father that I have also experienced in my lifetime, and that is racism, systematic injustice, and genocide. Nothing has changed.
It's a deep reflection on previous injustice. And going forward, if we want to really build that connection with Indigenous peoples, we have to have the land back. Land back is a philosophy.
Understanding from a deep place of what it means to be homo, to be indigenous to the land, to be of the land. It's not just physical, it's a conceptual space in what our future can hold on the land, where we can be our entire selves and address the violence against our bodies and our minds and our hearts and our spirits. It's time and space to heal.
When it comes down to it, it's pretty simple. It is about the jurisdiction and authority and autonomy that we should have as Indigenous peoples over our own land and our own territory.
So to enact back to land or land back, I really do believe that it needs to be an awakening of a self to act, whether that's to step forward or step back as a leader. Everyone has a place in this life to stand up for what is right. Everyone has a role to play, and it's not going to look the same for every person. It's not going to look the same for all backgrounds of peoples and nations, but it's our responsibility to act.
I think it means thinking about reciprocity, about what has already been taken forcibly from Indigenous people and then what other people can be offering in return. It's not enough to acknowledge the territory, but actually thinking about what are the protocols. Do they even know what they are?
When it comes to like government or how that works, let us decide. Let us take over the government. We can hire the mayors, hire the governors or whatever, let them do what they're doing or whatever. But initially, it's ours. So it's like when you think like, oh, we're just gonna go back to like some indigenous way of life or whatever, hopefully, because that's what would save the freaking planet. You know what I'm saying? Like, the reason why our planet is in crisis is because of industrialization. Is because of Europeans going and exploiting all over the place, wherever that, like Spain, England, and anyway. So LandBack is just giving it back to us, the original stewards of original place. And that goes, I just want to say, that goes to everywhere. I'm an advocate of LandBack everywhere. Africa, African nations, South Africa, whatever that looks like, give it back to the people. And if you say, well, how are we going to do that? Let me just say this, is that in and of itself is a thought that you know better, and it's probably European thought. It's Eurocentric. Only we know how to do this. Only we know how to make a government work. Only we know how to make community work. No, it's like, let us figure that out. Let us get together as Indigenous people and say, oh, this is what it'll look like. Again, abolish the United States of America, and we can make it whatever we want to, and have faith in us. Just have faith in us. All right, I'll stop.
So we're gonna kind of touch on like reparations as a whole, because reparations is a buzzword that's usually associated with, African Americans, Black Americans, but reparations as a concept can be something that all communities can benefit from, because to be honest, the US and a lot of European nations owe a lot of people reparations. They owe a lot of people, debts. And so our next clip is going to touch on reparations just a little bit.
While there are debates about what reparations look like, one scholar suggests starting with acknowledging the atrocity, aka slavery.
The material consequences of a history of state-sanctioned and state-complicit violence, extraction, exploitation, and fraud, as well as policies committed against Black people, manifest in terms of the racial wealth gap in an obvious way. The fact that Blacks make up 12 to 14% of the population, but own probably something in the order of less than 4% of the country's wealth, or maybe 3%, I think that's indicative of a material consequence.
You want to know why that's crazy? I'll tell you why. Over $600 million, or just about half of the country's economic activity in 1836, came directly or indirectly from cotton. Cotton-producing enslaved people were just 6% of the population, and we're only talking about cotton here. Enslaved people helped build this nation's wealth, but once they were emancipated, the system made sure that the formerly enslaved couldn't build wealth.
But the consequences go well beyond material. The large disparities that exist across race isn't because Blacks are a defective people, but rather there were events that have taken place both in the past and currently that have led to these gross inequalities.
Wait. Before we go too far in this conversation, let's talk about the beginnings of reparations for slavery. The idea has been around for around 150 years. I'm guessing that you've heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule? No, Spike Lee, not your production company. During the Civil War, hundreds of Black refugees were massacred under the watch of a Union general. After word got out to the press, the Secretary of War pushed for damage control. He met with 20 Black church leaders who suggested that the formerly enslaved should get land of their own. And get this, the government actually said yes. Hey, what? Field Order number 15 was drawn up to redistribute 40 acres to the formerly enslaved. What happened to the 40 acres proposed to Black folks, you say? Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson, a man who owned slaves, became president and threw the policy out the window. But throughout modern history, folks have made several attempts to keep the reparations conversation alive. In 1969, James Forman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee wrote the Black Manifesto demanding reparations from white religious institutions. Starting in 1989, Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill for reparations every single year until he left the House in 2017. And notably, in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates broke the internet with his 16,000-word piece, The Case for Reparations.
How do you define reparations?
Well, in the piece, we define it as America coming to grips with its own history.
Hamilton says reparations should consist of 3 components: acknowledgement, restitution or securing the bag, and reconciliation.
All right. So Asia talked on it. I mean, everybody knows this is definitely a buzzword that goes on. But in real world, like what would it look like to see descendants of enslaved people receive reparations in this lifetime, and how could it be enacted?
It's one of those words that, again, make people angry, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Just bringing up the idea of reparations. But a couple of things I want to address real quick. These folk talked about cotton, and the reason they talk about cotton is that's what we think of when we think about the South. We think of the 1800s and Scarlett O'Hara and slaves out picking cotton. And they call cotton old King Cotton. But understand the South, cotton was not king. Rice was king, and sugar was king. As a matter of fact, the slaves starting the slavery in the 1500s in Angola, over into South America, over into Brazil, where 80% of all Black slaves were taken, is focused on one thing, that's sugar. So when you look at history, understand that 90% of all slaves who are taken into captivity is for sugar. And then you have something that was more prosperous than cotton, which is rice, coming out of Senegal, which at one time made Charleston, South Carolina, the richest city in the world, was rice. So again, we're talking about that truth thing because we spend too much time talking about falsehoods. We're talking about Scarlett O'Hara and not truth. So that's the one thing I wanted to point out about that. The other thing is in the time leading after slavery in the coming of homesteading, homesteading came from 50 acres to 40 acres. And that's the reason that black folks was offered 40 acres instead of 50 acres, because when you go to back to the 1500s and the 1600s, in order to be a property owner, they were always cut out in blocks of 50 acres. So as we get to the 1860s, we see that change to 40 acres, okay? But I don't know if you guys saw the reparations flyer. Some of you may have it that I left on the table out there. I hope you please get those, because in it, it talks about an organization called the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. I am one of the charter members of the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, which is founded in New Jersey, in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, and I am the current vice president of the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. It addresses how do we get blacks to accept slavery, because there's a lot of black folks out there who don't want to talk about slavery. And two, how do we venerate those who was forcibly taken into enslavement? One of the biggest topics that we talk about, no matter how many board meetings we have, the topic of reparations always comes up. We cannot have an hour meeting without spending 20 minutes talking about reparations. And the reason I mention that is that when you get that flyer, you will see in there a woman named Dr. Evelyn McDowell. She is the founder and president of Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. And she is one of the leading figures that in California in April helped California to come to the conclusion that they need to do reparations. So Evelyn is a large part of the reparation movement in the United States. So I just want you guys to know about her, and if you pick up the little flyer I have out there, you can take a look at it, you can take a look at the website, you can contact her, whatever, and so we'd be happy to talk to everybody that we can about reparations. But the problem is reparations are not simple, whether you're talking Native or African Americans. Because when you're talking about free black people, we're not even talking about slaves, but free black people who lived in this country and who were never slaves back to the 1600s, we have to talk about how that discrimination created a lack of access for business, for homes, and unfair treatment under the law of those free black people. And so how do you measure how laws limited free black opportunities to succeed and grow? That has to be a part of reparations. If you limit my ability to expand my business, to extend my property, then should I be repaired for that? And what formulas do you use for growth, measuring that was inhibited by discrimination? So not only that you have to measure that I owned a business, but because of this discrimination, what's that difference between what I actually made and what I could have made? Right? So you're preventing me from just even expansion. Do we measure that? How do we measure lost generational wealth that was restricted by law? The 1705 Virginia slave codes, part of that was that slave code in creating the slave was that a wealthy black man could not give his wealth to his children. That means if I became a wealthy farmer, my son had to start from scratch because I could not give him my land, I could not give him my house, I could not give him my money. So how do you measure that loss of wealth? Now, enslaved black people, it's even worse. How do you compensate for uncompensated labor. There were folk who were born and who died as slaves and never received that compensation. How do you decide who should be compensated? And that's the legalese that they're stuck with in California, is not whether or not we should pay reparations. We should pay reparations, but who should get it, right? How do you reconnect families that were separated by slavery? Meaning, if my wife had a child and that child was sold into slavery, what happens for that family? Can that ever be repaired? What happens to how that son or daughter would have increased that family? How do you measure your lost generational wealth? I said that. How do you measure the potential of a person who prematurely dies from slavery abuse? What about that young, strong 17-year-old who could push that bell that only lives to be 27? What happens to that money he could have earned had he not been abused as a slave? How do victimized families be compensated? How we should be compensated? How we should be compensated is a false argument. It is a false argument because what it says is that now we're faced with the real burden of money. We're talking about money now. People who bring up that question don't want to talk about money. Because when you factor it out just intellectually, we're looking at tens or maybe hundreds of trillions of dollars over 400 years. So immediately when somebody says, how do we compensate you? You understand what they're saying is that I don't want to pay for that. Right? So we have a lot of things to discuss about reparations. When you look at natives, these people, children, were taken from them and put in a school. How do you compensate the emotional and spiritual loss of a father and a mother who just had their babies taken from them? How do you compensate a community for their spiritual and emotional and economic loss because someone took their babies from them? There's a hole, that's like dropping a hole over into the Native community. Imagine going home and you know what your neighborhood looks like, and you get back the night and all the children gone. How do you fix that? How do you fix something like that? How do you repair people who was marched across the winter snow out into Oklahoma and their family died on the way and all the property and stuff and other things that they owned that they left behind? How do you compensate that? So yes, this is a very difficult conversation for people to have, especially when you're looking at from 1500 on, almost 500 going on 600 years of taking people and dispossessing them and murder and genocide and diseases. Over half of the native population in this country died from the disease that was brought here by Europe. Half of the native population. How do you compensate them for all of that loss? So it's something that we really have to, it's hard to talk about and it's emotional to talk about, but it's something that needs to be addressed because something should be restored for people who have had everything taken from them, even down to their children taken from them. This has to be addressed. And just like Val said, not just here in the United States, but in Africa, don't you know when they went into Ghana, they killed 10 million black folks. When they went into India, they killed 3 million native Indians in India. So this is a thing that's all over the world. When you talk about reparations, you're just not talking about restoring one person. You're talking about how do you restore the people of an entire planet. And the only reason we don't talk about reparations for Chinese, you know why? It's because the Queen of China put all of the Europeans out and said, don't come back. Because the Europeans went there, took over their land, and then tried to lease it back to the Chinese. And she said, why am I leasing back my own country? Y'all need to go. And that's when they started calling her the dragon woman. I know you guys heard of the dragon woman of China. The Europeans started calling her the dragon woman because she evicted all of the Europeans out of her country. And that's why China is mostly Chinese now, because they don't allow they put the Europeans out.
We are running short on time, but I do want to get to the last part, which is touching on what you said, and it's like justice and what that would look like for different communities. So we can kind of stop on this last clip, and then we can kind of recap what our thoughts are.
Protection and recognition of our rights to land, control, of our economy, religious freedom, language restoration.
Defund the military-industrial complex that was used for the stealing of indigenous people's lands and the over-policing of our people today. Dismantle the system of white supremacy that was created in the first place for the stealing of our lands, whether that be the dismantling of certain parts of the court system, certain parts of bureaus of land management that not only played the role of stealing our lands, but maintain the theft of them. And then the actual physical returning of public lands.
The only compensation for land is land, and there's not an amount of payment, as evidenced in the Black Hills case, where the Lakota were offered $106 million for their land, and they rejected the settlement, which is now worth billions. Money is not the answer. The answer is land.
There is a role for everybody in the LandBack movement that we're building. For the white folks out there who think that we're a bunch of Indians wanting to storm the mountains and burn you out of your cabins, that's not what we're trying to do. The LandBack movement is about building collective power and collective liberation and building a world that works for everybody. Work there with us, work side by side with us to dismantle imperialism, colonialism, and a system of white supremacy and racial injustice. So, collaborate with us, be our relatives, be our co-conspirators, be our accomplices for dismantling these systems. Don't be scared of us for dismantling them.
So with that, one of the people said that, there's you really can't put a price on it. The only payment is land. And I think for a lot of Black people in this country, we don't have claim to land. And so the answer for us might be direct funds, might be money for us, and kind of what that looks like for different communities means something different. I think of even Haiti had to pay France back. They paid France reparations for basically them losing their labor force when they gained their freedom. They fought for their freedom. And so there's a lot of, again, ways that European countries, United States, owe people reparations, and there is no real price we can put on all the labor and everything that was stolen, language and culture, traditions. There's no real price we can put on that. But what would justice look like in your eyes for, various communities that we represent?
I think I want to, if I can, I'll address this. First here is a little history about me. Is my husband actually, he is Sicilian and Mexican, and he was in a part of the military-industrial complex, and he was a part of Special Forces. He was a Navy SEAL, served for 12 years, and the amount of money that flows through that when they're talking about the military-industrial complex is insane. And that was just from behind the curtains, I guess, just from his perspective. And then we made hard decisions as a family when we were in San Diego after my husband was asked to be a part of a fundraising for Navy SEAL Foundation. To these people, I think, paid $30,000+ to golf with Navy SEALs. It sounds absurd, but it's embarrassing to say. And what was really hard about that is, if you see my husband, he's wrapped in tattoos in his abdomen of all the brothers that he lost. Because our troops don't go in there because they are a part of this higher industrial complex. It's because they are, forgive me, brainwashed to believe that it's purely about the brotherhood. And this is from my husband. I'm quoting him. Love you, babe, if you're listening. But he made a really hard decision that I could never love him anymore for. And they came up to him during that golf tournament. They were oil tycoons, and they thanked him for protecting their oil in Afghanistan. And it changed him for the rest of his life. And I get emotional because that was a really hard time to hear that, because you hear conspiracy theories, you hear all this stuff, but to actually hear that, and the things that my husband saw with children there and how they were treated, to watch his brothers get killed, was nothing having to do with oil interest for what he thought he was there for. And because of that, he got out. And he would never serve as a contractor. He refused to serve or organize any tactical schools, which people tried to recruit him for. He would not be a part of any of it. He completely rebuilt his life. We came here with nothing, basically started over, and he sought education and achieved it and got his master's. That was when we talked about decolonizing, and we're talking about this. So what does all this look like? It's on a macro and a micro. This is what our family, we had to make these decisions as a family because this is what it looks like, making these changes on a personal level. And then we have amazing people doing things on this huge platform in our nation. And so I just say that to share that with you. So when I hear that, because it is something that's very personal. And when they're talking about it, and it always feels good to me because we don't see Alaska Natives in a lot of stuff when they talk about Native Americans. So when I saw Alaska Native people, I was like, yes, what's up? But we had something similar when you're talking about what does that look like? Is it monetary? Is it land? The only way, and I had the pleasure of sitting with Winona LaDuke at Oregon State University, and she's a phenomenal woman, phenomenal activist. And, in Alaska, they did give allotments of land to all of our elders, but they locked any future generations born after the 1970s from being members of the corporations that were formed as a result of the Alaska Native Settlements Claims Act. So it's like, oh, that's really great, but future generations cannot inherit this wealth. So it's like, there's work to be done. It's not perfect. My grandma sold her land back to get money because she's living in a trailer. She had to do what she had to do. And I just say this because there in Alaska, what I said I was going to talk about is we have 13 regional corporations that we formed. It sounds funny, instead of tribes, they're called corporations. And we took that money that we got from the US government and we formed our own businesses, entities, own investments, and we pay out. We receive dividends as part of shareholders, being a part of that. And I'm not saying that that's the answer. That's kind of what it looks like for people who have tried, for my people who have tried to, how do we pay back and how do we give? And when I heard Robert say that, I'm like, what can we do? What does that look like? It's such a big question. How do we? How much is that worth that you lost your child? How much is that worth that your family was torn apart? How much was that worth that you were taken from your ancestral lands? And so those are really hard questions, but I would start with free education. Don't make me take out your loans that you charge me interest on, because I literally had to go to school to learn how to be a mom. My grandmother, when she was a child, was forced to sleep. And I say this because I want you to see the humanity in this. That's why I'm here. My grandmother was forced to sleep on the porch with the dogs, and the missionary couple that took her in because her parents were killed by TB from a European disease. And she was relocated because Aleuts or Unungan people were put in internment camps for World War II. Her parents died. She was an orphan, had to sleep on the porch with the dogs because she was Native. That's what they told her. A little girl lost her parents, forced to sleep in the cold porch with the dogs because they didn't even see her as human. So I had to go back to school to learn what it means to be a mother, because I didn't have that solid figure so that my boys could be raised with love. And I don't say this because I'm like, yeah, US government, pay me back. I'm like, that's the own personal work and choice I had to make so I could learn what proper, typical child development, how do you show up for a child? Because I didn't have that with my mother or my father who was schizophrenic, broken spirits. So part of my job for all their activism that they did was for me to do the healing work. I was gifted with that. And I don't lie when I say this, and it's no exaggeration when I say my ancestors stand behind me to lift me up for that which is so hard. So thank you, Koyana.
And I think this goes along with what was in the reparations clip is like, you know, she listed 3 things, and the first thing was acknowledgement, and we're going back to acknowledging the real and true history of what's happened so that we can move forward. And if we're not acknowledging how families were torn apart and devastated and the trauma that our ancestors went through and trauma that they also passed down to us, if we can't acknowledge that, it's going to be really hard to move forward. So I would like to hear from some of the other panelists just kind of what you think justice would look like going forward for our respective communities.
Carl? He's deep in thought.
Go ahead, Carl.
I got so many things to talk about, but are we doing a close? Is this the closing?
We're getting there. We're gonna see if we
We're
have
getting
time for some audience questions, but just want to get your
Okay,
kind
sorry. So let me say something. First, we need to acknowledge that money, like the money that we have, the banking system, whatever, that's all a colonial project in and of itself. And so really for indigenous people, it is land. Land is land, like Winona said. Land is land. That's the only thing that there is land. And I think that what's hard for Europeans to conceptualize is how indigenous people consider land, or like what our relationship with land is. That is like a sacred relationship. It's not I utilize this. It's not an exploitation or what can the land give me. It is what do I give the land? How do I live with the land? How do I make sure that everything is going right? Because the Creator said, do all of these things. So, yeah, it's very complicated. Obviously, it's very complicated, but like for us as indigenous people, it is land back, actual land. It is political power back, actual political power. Let us decide what happens. And just so y'all understand, and because of a lot of people are scared, is like, does land back mean that everyone goes back to where they came from? One is, if an indigenous person, if the council or whatever says, you all need to go back home, then you need to go back home. If they said that to me, I would have to do that myself. My tribes are from Arizona, okay? Arizona, California, whatever. And then on my mother's side, England, Ireland, Germany. So all I'm saying is recognize where you're at, and if they say do something, you do it. That's really putting like your money where your mouth is, And this is what I really hate, because it's like vote, like vote and get into the system. But right now, yeah, vote. Like vote for the people that listen to the indigenous people, Like, don't vote for the people that are taking indigenous people's lands away. Don't vote for the people that aren't for human rights, whether that's trans rights, black rights, undocumented immigrants' rights, whatever. Like, don't vote for those people. And one thing that I know is like controversial, but I think that we can understand that now is in the reparations, you cannot give stolen land, to somebody else as compensation. You cannot do that. I mean, that's essentially and another thing is acknowledging that, yeah, just because you bought your land, wherever you bought, if you have land, it's stolen land. Like, if something was stolen, it was stolen. Like, if someone stole something from me and somebody else bought it at a pawn shop, whose was that anyway? You give it back to the owner, right? And it doesn't matter how many generations go. Okay, and this is what I want to say is, sorry, I'm saying a lot of things. I hear this all the time. Well, this is the way that it is now. How do we go forward now? That was then, this is now. And that is the most privileged thing to say. That is so privileged. Well, because I'm in this position now, and I have this much stuff now, or I have this, or whatever, let's just start from here. Okay, that's not fair. You don't get to start from a place of privilege or a place of wealth or whatever that is without reparations, without reconciliation, without going back and fixing the wrongs. You know, like nobody here stole anybody or did anything like that or stole land, probably, but we're all benefiting from it. I'm benefiting from it. I'm in the same boat as everyone else. In Salt Lake City, I am in the same boat. Just because I'm indigenous to somewhere doesn't mean that I have the same rights to Salt Lake City, because I don't.
Get it, Carl.
Yeah, and with that, like I was saying before, you know, there's always that tie between Mother Earth. So, you know, that's why we acknowledge certain sacred spots. I think that's why, you know, yeah, you know, people can put a price on a temple. Oh, this is how much it's going to cost. Oh, we want this in it. We want this. We want that. You know, they're always thinking monetary value on everything. And that's the thing about it that we see a lot when we go up against the fossil fuels or anything like that. You know, they just see resources, you know, then compared to us where we see our ancestors' homeland, you know, or other indigenous people's homeland. You know, you think of all the generations that survived on that land, you know, and, you know, the monetary concept, you know, to me, that's a colonial mindset, is because we believed in a good trade. You know, if you wanted to trade pelts, you know, you gave something in value, you know, and both sides will agree it was a fair trade. You know, I mean, look how, Manhattan got acquired, you know, beads, you know, they made it look all shiny and stuff like that, you know. But, you know, there's always been a con man, you know, or what are those guys called, those snake?
Yeah, snake oil salesman.
Yeah, you know, they've always wanted to take advantage of the less. That's how a lot of land also got stolen, was through bad translation, is because the person translating didn't understand the language. So he would use a wrong word that he thought would represent something else. So when he told it to the tribal members, the elders, they would say, oh yeah, that's a good deal. But then when he translated it, it was something else, you know. That's why a lot of tribes here on Turtle Island have colonial names, you know, like the Sioux, you know, that comes from the French, you know. That's why when you talk to them, they acknowledge, I'm Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. You know, even down where I'm from, my mom's side, they're categorized us as Pueblo Indians, but we have Towas, Tiwas, Tewas. You know, we have all these different things, but it's the mindset of value, I think, that kind of screwed up a lot of things here. And they expect us to think the same way. And, you know, through boarding schools, they tried assimilating us, you know, to think their way, you know. But the only thing was, they didn't like an educated Indian. They liked the nice Indian, you know, because they could take advantage of them. They liked the token Indian, you know. But when they had to deal with an educated Indian or native or indigenous, that's why they were always scared, is because they couldn't tell their lies to them. That's why a lot of these things we're getting back is through education. Like Val said, we're speaking their language, we're using their own laws against them. But what do? They make more laws to make sure they have the upper hand. And so, I mean, it's like land. They can't acknowledge without seeing the resources they can steal off the land. You know, like Carl said, you know, gold, coal, oil, you know, but we just see Mother Earth. And I think that's why a lot of that will be, and I think that's what's mind-blowing to them is you just want land, you know? But there too, you know, they gotta have that history of how they acquired it the wrong way. But that's what they never want to admit, you know, is how they gained this land. That's why when I was saying earlier, you know, how would it look if treaties were honored? You know, how many squatters would be, you know, had to go on their own Trail of Tears? And so that's why if you can understand the history of the natives in the area they were placed as stewards to take care of the land, you could see why they would value land over monetary, you know, because you have families, community that have lived, died on this land, and even to protect it. You know, it's and that's one thing, when they see protection, it's not protection to them. It's going in there forcefully and taking it. That's all they've ever learned. That's what they tried teaching us too. But, you know, that's why they can't understand the native way. That's why when you have other subjects, you go into somebody's territory, natives think differently. And that's why there's a lot of non-natives that can't understand, well, why did they want this deal? You know, it's because they don't know certain protocols with certain tribes and stuff. And most of the time they offend them, you know. So, but yeah, it's you know, land. It'd be nice to get it all back, but you know, we believe in communities. You know, that's why tribes have always survived through communities. We watch over our people, you know. We just don't favor the rich, you know. And that's one thing that this land has gotten to is we don't use we, us. It's more like I, me. You know, they've lost that sense of community. And that's one thing where if we get that community mindset back again, yeah, Mother Earth will heal. It's because we know we won't be robbing her, raping her of her resources, you know. And I think that's one thing, yeah, acknowledge that what has been done to the people of this land, you know, without any buts, you know. So, but, you know, also too, you know, acknowledge, okay, yeah, nobody's going to be willing to give the land, their stolen land that they acquired, you know. So that's a fight in itself. But I don't know. I guess that's all I have to say.
I can honestly say I don't know what restitution looks like. I mean, that's a lot. But I think for me, where it would start is 1, keeping your promises. 2, leaving people alone. I come to the leave the people alone part is because I look at a person like Supreme Court Justice Thomas. Whether you know a lot, Supreme Court Justice Thomas started off a very black activist. And he was like, pro-black man, do this, do that, right? But what he was teaching was unrealistic. The same thing, we had the same conversation about Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise. Again, was saying, don't worry, black man, just work and everything was gonna be all right. It's interesting, the first thing we saw from the first clip was Tulsa, Oklahoma. These people were not bothering anybody, yet they were not left alone. We have contracts and agreements with Native nations, but we don't leave them alone. Right? We say what you need to do is get an education and excel, and everything's going to be all right. The problem is, even when you do that, people don't leave you alone. Remember I said there used to be 100 black townships in Oklahoma? Those people were not left alone. They got there, they got pieces of arid land like was given to the natives. They made the land successful. And once they made it successful, guess what? Somebody wants it now. So the bank accidentally loses your payment for your farm. Somebody comes out and threatens the homeowner with lynching, so the people have to leave. Restitution has to start with allowing the people to live their lives and leave them alone. That's how it starts. Once we do that, we can start having the difficult conversation of how do we restore what was taken from them. But we cannot have that conversation with natives if we're constantly going out every other year talking about we need this piece of land for money. We can't have that conversation. Again, you have broken trust, and you're asking someone to trust you when you have had a history of lying and mistreating them.
Well, just want to thank all of you for showing up and, being so passionate about this subject. Really appreciate it. This was a very, I feel like, needed conversation. It's very complicated, very complex, can be very uncomfortable, but I really believe that this was a conversation that needed to be had. This is an ongoing conversation in our respective communities, and it's one that we do need to have together because we are on this land together, and what happens going forward. And so I hope that we were able to maybe figure out what some steps could be moving forward. And just to recap some of the things we talked about again, like the acknowledgement piece is really important, confronting the real and true history of what has happened in this country and other countries is going to be really important. We've heard a lot about dismantling white supremacy, decolonizing our minds, also not trying to replicate what kind of colonized people have done. I'm reminded of an Audre Lorde quote where she says, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. And I think so often we try to do that, trying to replicate that in our own communities, and we can't do it that way. That's not the way forward. So again, want to thank all of you for coming here tonight, giving us your words. Do we have time for audience questions? Okay. We don't have any, we don't have time for audience questions, but if you do want to speak to any of us or the panelists, maybe outside, if you are open to that, please feel free to reach out to all of us. Again, thank you all for coming out tonight.
Yeah.
Are you saying something?
I just want to say thank you to Carl, Robert, Dave, and Valine, and just a reminder to everybody, the work doesn't stop. This was just one step of many steps. I know we throw the word around ally and solidarity a lot, especially in today's time. But those words are powerful, and they're not just words. It really, there's a lot of responsibility that goes with carrying that torch, carrying that flame, and it really, we all rely on each other, but we all rely on everyone to make sure that if there's an opportunity to correct a wrong, we do it. If there's anything these last couple of years have taught us, this is not the time to be silent. This is the time to let your voice be heard and stand up for what is right. And so once again, I just want to thank everybody for being a participant tonight.
I want to say something real fast because I really appreciate everyone for being here. I want to reemphasize this point that we're all related and we all have medicines. And like Val was saying, we all have different unique characteristics at what we do. And it's important that we do what we do the best. We do those things. And we let other people do what they do the best. We let them do those things. Because it's only when we do what we're supposed to do that the world works. But when we like try to step on other people's toes, I could, you know, like just do what you do best, and then we can all be cool.
All right, thank you. Get home safely.